Hello and good evening. My name is Daniel Cunningham. I am a horticulturist at Rooted In. And on behalf of my colleague Patrick Dickinson and our wonderful sponsors at Water is Awesome, I wanted to give you a warm welcome for our virtual program today titled Choosing the Right Plants for the Right Place, where we are going to dig into not only plant selection, but also landscape design with a focus on some of our favorite native plants. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I mentioned Water is Awesome. If you're not familiar with their website and their resources, there are some great DIY gardening guides, one of which goes along with tonight's class, and you can just click on those from their website, waterisawesome.com. You can download them, and they will help you grow a lush, vibrant lawn, landscape, or vegetable garden, while at the same time being a better steward of our natural resources. Now, they also have some great tips on knowing how much to water and when to water, and you can find several programs there. You just simply type in your address. If you want to receive messaging via text message or email, and based on local weather station data, they will tell you how long you need to run your irrigation system, whether you have spray heads, rotors, multi-stream rotors, or maybe hose and irrigation at your home. There's also some great tips on just how much water you can save in your landscape. Again, that is waterisawesome.com. Lots of great tips to grow a healthy landscape. And healthy landscapes have several benefits beyond the home. They can increase the home's value, certainly, but they can also reduce our utility bills, whether that is helping to cool the home in the summer or help warm the home in the winter. They can also clean and filter the air kind of locally in your landscape, as well as controlling flooding and erosion. And then one of the great benefits is because so much of our water is used outdoors, if we can grow healthy plant material that is native or adapted to our region, once they're established, they can really help us reduce our water demand. So we want to kind of go over and review some of the guidelines or the steps that we would take to create that healthy landscape. Now, one of the things that my colleague Patrick will dig in deeper today is on the design phase, and we'll also spend time with plant selection, specifically talking about our favorite native plants, but you may be thinking about how you can come up with an irrigation plan as well to protect that investment and keep the plants alive. We'll also be talking a little bit about hardscape, and pretty much hardscape is just the things in the landscape that are not plant material. So these could be pathways, they could be mulch or gravel, patios using flagstone or pavers. We like to recommend those hardscapes that actually infiltrate water so that can reduce localized flooding, but also our plants can take advantage of that water if we infiltrate it into the ground, creating healthy biologically active soil. It kind of works like a sponge. So we want to be greedy with our water and catch every drop into that hardscape. Soil preparation is also something to think about. We've talked in some of our other programs about the challenges in North Texas soils. Certainly compost is our favorite soil amendment, but spend some time on the soil prep and your plants will begin to thank you. Well, plant installation is also a huge part of that. So once you've kind of come up with your design and your irrigation plan and installed the hardscape and prepared your soil, that's really the fun part. We'll talk about some great plants for you to choose from. You also don't want to forget the mulch. Mulching 2 to 4 inches is going to help reduce soil temperatures. It's also going to help to infiltrate water as well as reduce evaporation or the water that's lost from the soil on especially hot and windy summer days. Also, we all know that mulch reduces weeds, so that saves time in terms of maintenance in the garden. And then to come up with a watering schedule, again, for establishment when you're planting new plants, and then you can taper that off, which is one of the great benefits of planting native plants that are adapted to our sometimes harsh and unpredictable climate. But again, we're going to dig into especially the design and plant selection aspects tonight. Now, I do want to also address some of the challenges to growing plants. Some folks tuning in may be coming here from different areas. Of course, North Central Texas is one of the fastest growing areas in the region. And whether you're new to Texas or new to gardening, or you've been gardening here for a while, you'll know that the heat can take its toll on the landscape. Both air and soil temperatures can be a challenge, and then not just extreme heat, but extreme freezing temperatures are also a factor. Sunlight, finding the right plant for the right amount of sunlight in your area is something we'll talk more about. The quantity and quality of sunlight you have on your property will determine what plants you can actually put in those zones and areas. We have a lot of pests that we have to deal with here in North Central Texas. Of course, weeds are one of those. Weeds are just a plant out of place, what we want to talk about different ways we can control those. And then other pests could be pest insects or diseases. But the great thing about natives is typically they're going to be resistant or more resilient to those pests. And then water is a growing issue in North Central Texas. And it's not only a growing issue because water is the most limiting factor to plant growth, but also because we live in such a rapidly growing population. We have to figure out how to do more with less water, so we have plenty of water available for growth and prosperity for years to come. And that's really what I wanted to kind of springboard off of starting tonight's presentation. If you're not familiar, we get most all of our water here in North Central Texas from our local lakes and our reservoirs. You can kind of see on the map here, most of our lakes are actually full right now. And so that's great that we've had some good, well-timed rain events, but we still want to keep conservation on the top of mind because we do live, again, in such a fast-growing area. In fact, the Texas Water Development Board estimates we'll have 51 million people in the state of Texas in the next 50 years, and some estimates show as high as 54 million. And so that just means we have to be better stewards of that natural resource, so we have plenty of water for washing our hair or for washing dishes or bathing or any of those critical things that we use water for. Now, also, as our city and urban areas begin to grow, you'll notice that they've changed quite a bit from what the landscape looked like 100 or 200 years ago. We've got Bessie, our bison, here to kind of help us with the demonstration. But imagine that we had a thunderstorm come in like we saw this weekend at 200 years ago. We'd see about 50% of that water infiltrate, but only about 10% of that water run off. Now we have a city and dense urban areas with parking lots and concrete and roads. Now when those same raindrops hit, they can't actually infiltrate into the soil as well because they hit those pervious or impervious rather surfaces. There's not those pervious surfaces. And so the water always when it goes to the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, that means 55% of the water is now running off of our landscapes, and we see increased chances of flash flooding like we saw this weekend. And so we want to make sure that we can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, especially in our urban area. As that relates to runoff, we'd like to reduce runoff anywhere we can, because over that 200-year period, we've seen more runoff in our urban areas. We've seen decreased quality with it picking up different pesticides and pathogens. Unfortunately, with that, we have sediment, toxic contaminants that are taken with those water drops and end up in nearby creeks and eventually in our lakes where we get our drinking water from, but also where we get our water from the landscape. So there's plenty of things that you can do to be part of that solution. Now, another challenge that we're going to face in our landscapes in most growing season in Texas is going to be drought. And if we do have extreme drought, that really can create some challenges with the availability of water for outdoor use. In fact, the Texas Water Development Board estimates that we are going to have an expected decline in our water resources over the next 50 years, which really means that we do have to kind of tie in to how we can save water in the landscape so we do have that water for critical infrastructure processes. Well, the solution is really just to give your landscape a little bit of a CPR, and that's where native plants really play a role. They can help us with conservation to save water, soil, energy, and improve air quality, while we can preserve and enhance habitat and ecological functions, the same ecological functions that we would see in that short grass or mixed grass prairie where Bessie the bison was. The P in CPR will help us to disconnect impermeable surfaces. So those concrete areas, sidewalks and driveways and rooftops, if as much as possible, we can actually allow those raindrops into our landscape by breaking up hard surfaces and letting them sink into the ground. Then our plants nearby can take advantage. Another way we can do that is to create soil that is biologically active and will help us hold on to water. The R in CPR is retention. So again, we want to be greedy with those water droplets to grade, to capture water, to allow it to slow spread and sink throughout the landscape where our plants can take advantage during those drought periods. And the bonus there is we can also during that process eliminate runoff and those pollutants that we've talked about. Now, one of the design principles that I really like, and it's something that Patrick's going to dig more into, is the landscape rule of thirds. And so primarily in urban areas, the dominant species is going to be turf grass. And certainly there are turf grasses that work well in our landscape and are adapted to our area. But whatever warm season turf grass you're looking at, I would try to consider reducing that turf grass area to about a third of the landscape. That gives you plenty of room to play with your kids or to take the dogs out to play. But it's reducing of the demand of the high water and high maintenance needs associated with turf grass. Now, a lot of people don't realize that landscape beds with perennial flowers and shrubs and trees actually not only are less maintenance than turf grass, but they can also reduce our water demands, they can reduce our maintenance demands. And so it can help create a lush, vibrant landscape that looks great, but is also functional and efficient with our natural resources. Now, the other third that we have here again, is the hardscape. And I mentioned that's everything in the landscape that is not plant material. So this could be your borders, it could be your edging, it could be patios and pathways. But as much as possible, when we're choosing those elements, we want to allow the water to actually infiltrate. So water droplets can slowly spread inside of gravel or decomposed granite, or even in between the spaces of pavers or flagstone. That also creates usable outdoor space. So it connects spaces where you can walk using your pathways to take out the trash or to walk from one side of the landscape to another. There could be patios where you can actually sit and enjoy the spaces utilizing outdoor rooms. So as much as possible, I would try to transition your landscape to that landscape rule of thirds. And I think that you'll find a lot of benefits, not only in terms of environmental benefits, but also just creating a space that you can use and enjoy. Now, we do recommend native and adapted plants in all of our programs, and so many times when we start saying native plants, this is the picture that comes into mind. People think we're talking about landscapes with cacti and yucca and rocks as the dominant features. And although those landscapes are great in some parts of the state and in other states like Arizona and Utah, we get quite a bit of rainfall here in north central Texas, ranging from 36 to 38 inches of rainfall in an average year. And so one of the things that we want to drive home is that we can create landscapes that are lush and vibrant and have a variety of different colors and textures with their plant material that aren't just kind of those drab xeric landscapes. Now, we really want to focus on the native plants tonight. And those are plants that are hardy. They're from Texas. They've evolved in our sometimes harsh and unpredictable climate. They're going to be adaptable to our soils, as diverse as soils as we have in north central Texas. Primarily, they're going to be dominated by heavy clays, and most of our native plants are going to do quite well in those soils. They're also adaptable to the extreme weather that we've seen, whether that's extreme freezing temperatures like we saw this spring, or in February, as well as our extreme heat that we've seen with our 100+ degree days. And we've had a pretty mild summer, but we know that the next summer, the summer after that, we're probably going to kind of see the other side of that with more 100-degree days than average. The other benefit of native plants that many of y'all may be interested in is their ability to provide food and shelter for native bees, for butterflies and birds. And that's something that really gets me excited about native landscaping. In fact, I was just watching the Gulf fritillaries kind of float around in our backyard. And I think that's something that the whole family can enjoy when you've created a landscape that not only is great for people, but is great for pollinators as well. And then at the same time, native plants have the ability to help save you time and money. And whether you care about going green, I know what most people do care about is saving green, and those two can go hand in hand. Now, I wanted to kind of dive into some of the resources we have on our website, rootedin.com. One of those is our top 100 plants for North Texas list. Now, these are native and adapted plants, but I would say 70% of those are actually natives. You can download that PDF. We'll talk more about that here a little bit later. But that's kind of a great starting point. We'll also dig into some more plant list resources that will help you. But I wanted to just kind of inform you, or kind of maybe it's hitting home for folks that have experience with plant selection, but we want to make sure that the plants, whether they're from our plant list or they're plants that we're finding out in the nursery trade, fit both our macro environment and our micro environment. And so you may be familiar with our hardiness zone. It's basically just the 30-year average of the coldest temperature. That puts us in zone 8A, which means on average in north central Texas, we get down to about 10 to 15 degrees is the coldest temperature we see on average. Now, can we see temperatures colder than that? Well, certainly we've seen, saw temperatures of -4 this year in some spots. But we want to plant as much as possible those native plants that are perennial in our area that are going to come back year after year. So if we see on the plant tag, they're cold hardy to at least zone 8A or a number smaller than that, then we know they're going to come back. What we don't want to do is plant plants that are only cold hardy to zone 8B or 9A, because if we get even a normal freezing year, those plants would die or die back to the ground. So we'll kind of just keep that in mind from a standpoint of plant selection. Also, we want to make sure that we're choosing plants that are adaptable to our soil type and pH. We have, if you've attended some of our other classes, we've talked about this in detail, but heavy clays, high pH soils are the ones that we see most often in our area. We want to make sure that if we're putting plants in the ground, they can do well and thrive in those challenging soils. Now, also, we want to make sure that plants do well in our water regime. I mentioned we average from 36 to 38 inches of water in our area, a little bit drier on the west side of the Metroplex, a little bit wetter on the east side of the Metroplex. We could see years where we only get 18 inches of rainfall a year. We could see years where we get up to 60 inches of rainfall a year. But really, we want to try and target plants that are adaptable to those rainfall patterns, both the lean years and the really wet years. So those plants are going to thrive season after season. The microenvironment is also important to look at. That's really looking at your environment at a local level, your side of town, or maybe your neighborhood specifically, or your side of the house. How much sunlight or shade do you have on your property, and what affects that? Are there buildings nearby or trees? The orientation of your home. Typically, the west side of the home is going to be the hottest. The south side of your home is going to be the sunniest. We always see more shade on the north side of the home because the sun's path is kind of blocked by homes and fences and nearby trees. And then typically the eastern sun early in the morning tends to be kind of the most diffused and the most gentle. And so there's certain plants that really thrive in those areas, but there are also tons of native plants that really thrive in those hot spots on the west side too. But But that's all part of putting the right plant in the right place, paying attention to those buildings and structures. The other thing is when sunlight is shining through a tree, you're going to get a little bit of sunlight, kind of dappled sunlight coming through the tree branches. But if the sun is shining on a house, there's really no sunlight can shine through that back shade. So typically the sunlight blocked by homes or structures are going to be kind of the densest shade area. And we have more of that about that in the guide that goes along with tonight's class if you want to dig deeper. Pavement also plays a role. So a lot of times you've heard in urban areas about the heat island effect, and that's when things radiate. There could be concrete heat throughout the evening. And so those are a little bit of hot spots. And we can see that near our driveways, on our sidewalks. And there are plants that really kind of thrive in those hot spots. It could be Texas sage or some of our native grasses. Blackfoot daisy really work well there. But if you notice those spots are a little bit more challenging, it's really critical to put a plant in that spot that is going to be able to resist those challenges.
I wanted to take a little break from the PowerPoint and come outside and dig deeper into some of the information that we can find on a plant tag. Now, our first line of defense for choosing the right plant for the right spot should be our local plant databases and plant lists. So you can find at rootedin.com our top 100 plants for North Texas, which includes mostly native plants, and you can search by their sunlight, their water needs. There's also some great information on the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center's database, where you can search just strictly for native plants for all the different sizes and colors of blooms and times of blooms. There's also some great information at our local Native Plant Society chapter websites, and so you can search those for plant list of native plants adaptable to North Central Texas, as well as the Texas Smartscape database, which again is a database of native and adapted plants to our region, where you can search just for plants that are native, but again, their height, their sunlight needs, their water needs, all that great information. Now, secondarily, you may be shopping at a local nursery and you're looking for a plant and maybe you don't have one of those lists or access to that database handy. Now, each plant is going to have a plant tag, and that plant tag typically is going to have a picture of the plant as well as the common name on there. And the common name is great, but a lot of plants actually share the same common name, so we do want to refer to the scientific name or the genus and the species that is unique to each plant, so we know we're selecting the right plant for the right spot. Now, also on the plant tag, we'll see the exposure or the amount of sunlight that that plant prefers, whether that's full sun, part shade, full shade, or dense shade. And that will help you select a plant for the right area in your landscape. Some plants can actually grow great in full sun to full shade, where other plants have more kind of picky exposure requirements. Water needs are also something that you'll find on the plant tag. Now, at Rooted In, we do like to recommend plants that are either low water users or medium water users, so they're efficient with our natural resources and can grow well after they're established in a typical year in North Central Texas. Now, also, you may find some plants that are a little bit higher water needs. They may work well in a bioswale or a rain garden, or perhaps in a pot that's closer to a faucet, where you can give it just a little bit of touch of extra irrigation if you need to. Now, you'll also find information referring to the height and the width or the spacing. Now, that's really critical because a lot of plants start off in these containers a little bit smaller. In fact, we put them in the ground the first year. We like to say they sleep that first year, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. Now, it's important that we are paying attention to proper spacing, even if those plants start out small, because in that third year where they really start to expand, we don't want them to grow into each other and outcompete each other for water needs or sunlight needs or even nutrients. So pay attention to that spacing as well as the mature height of the plant, so we're not overshadowing a plant, putting it into the ground and outcompeting a plant that's already growing nearby. You'll also see the hardiness zone. So we've dug into that information, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So we know that the hardiness zone typically refers to a number in a letter of the 30-year average that we see in that zone. So here in north central Texas, we're in hardiness zone 8A, which means on average, 30-year average, we get down to about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, some years, like this past February, we could get significantly colder than that, but what we want to focus on is plants that are perennial to that hardiness zone, so we know most years, year after the year, those plants are going to come back and thrive and be successful. Now, if we are choosing a plant that has on it, a hardiness zone like 7B or cold hardy down to 7A or 6B, we want to note that those plants are going to be cold hardy to temperatures below 10 degrees, below 5 degrees. And so that's great. You should definitely plant those plants. But what we want to caution you is planting plants that are only cold hardy to zone 8B or 9A, meaning that in most years, those would probably die back to the ground, if not die all the way together. Now, speaking of that, you also may find on the plant tag if a plant is deciduous or evergreen. Now, most folks know that evergreen means that it's going to have year-round interest or keep its leaves through the fall, the winter, and into spring. But there are other great plants that are deciduous, which means they're going to lose their leaves during that winter season, perhaps die back to the ground, but most of those plants are going to pop right back up in the spring and gives months of blooms through the growing season. Another speck of information you might find on the plant tag is if a plant is an annual or a perennial. Now, annual plants like our annual wildflowers are going to pop up. They're going to bloom and produce seeds all in 1 year. So their whole life cycle is in 1 year, where perennial plants live 3 years or more. They're going to stay in the same place and thrive season after season. But that's all the information you'll find on the plant tab. Typically, it's either going to be on the tag itself or perhaps even on the pot or container. If you don't find that information, just search by the scientific name on any of those websites if you have your cell phone handy at the nursery, and you can help find the right plant for the right place for your landscape. Now I'm going to toss it back over to Patrick, where he's going to dig into some more information about our favorite native plants.
Thank you, Daniel. This next topic is an exciting topic for me as a designer. I tend to get excited about design. I love learning new things about design, new design styles and different ways, thinking outside the box and doing some fun and adventurous things in landscapes and introducing people to new ways of doing things and not necessarily looking at that kind of cookie cutter basic way that builders and other designers may be designing landscapes. I want you to have something unique. I want you to have something that you're passionate about and you really want to be outside and enjoy. But there's certain design principles, basic base principles that we need to follow to ensure that you're successful in this, because some of these give you that definition, the structure and the flow in your garden. And this is where some people struggle and things tend to look like a green blob and you don't know where things end and stop or how to get from point A to point B. And so I want to go over these top 10 principles that I've chosen for you to help steer you in the right direction and being successful in this. And this is important for you to put this on paper as well. Kind of give yourself that design, or I like to call it your instruction manual, that you will follow and be successful and not question it. You heard Daniel talking about the right plants for the right place and things of that nature and proper plant spacing. And that's really important, and why putting it on paper is important, because so many times people go to buy that plant in the nursery and it's about this big, but when we tell them it specs out at like 3 feet by 3 feet, but they see this little tiny plant, they're going, well, I'm going to put 3 in there instead of 1 because they look so small. Well, then you have an overcrowding situation and overplanted. So we want you to trust that spacing, just like we want you to do these design principles. And the first and foremost, most important design principle that I really enjoy talking about are the lines. This is one of the most important base principles, and it really gives you the structure. It connects spaces and gives you the definition that so many people tend to lose or not have in their garden. And this can be in edging and walkways. Plant material can create lines, and we're not necessarily talking about hedges. Hedges do come with a little bit of a high maintenance plant tag or high maintenance tag with them. And we don't necessarily want that high maintenance tag for you unless you do want some hedges to give a little bit of formality formality to your garden. I'm not a hedge person. I like a little bit more of a free-form garden and a low maintenance garden. So I don't want a landscape that really depends too much on me. But as you can see in this photo right here, and you can follow my mouse, this nice walkway is fun. It gives you a little bit of a walking through, cutting through of different what we call rooms or pockets of a garden. You can see you've got a pocket over here. Where'd my mouse go? A pocket goes over here, and then it transitions into here, and then you go out and across this walkway, and you could take this walkway. It's like a little maze, and it's fun. But then the edging around the turf grass gives you that definition to where you really see that oval shape. And then that seating wall gives you some definition as well. And even the lines of the plants that help define out around the between that walkway and between that turf grass. It all gives you definition, and that's really important for you. Now, contemporary modern design tends to lean more towards clean lines, straight modular type lines like you see in here. But you can still have fun with this. As you can see here, this walkway gives us these beautiful lines going through. But then as you hang a left right here, you're cutting through portions of the grass. So it kind of feels like a different room or different pocket of that garden. And then it transitions back around to these beautiful planters to that front door. And you even have a patio space over there. And it all encompasses and surrounds this beautiful water feature in the garden. So modern tends to lean towards those cleaner lines. Formal gardens, going back into those hedges. I like to show this picture, not that it's a native landscape, but to kind of give you a warning to this, because in this garden right here, we have these beautiful formal hedges. But what happens if this one on the corner right there dies? That now becomes a focal point in your garden, that blemish in the garden that draws people's eye to that flaw in the garden. So be very careful with formal symmetrical gardens. We don't typically design for symmetry as much anymore. And I'll touch base on that with another design principle. And then here you can see that beautiful walkway cutting through this oxidized steel that's leveling out that planter all the way up to the front door. There's a lot of lines and definition in the garden. And it's also mass plantings. You know, mass plantings can give a lot of cleanliness or balance in a garden. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that balance portion of the design principles. Here you can see this design right here, which is a recent design that we've done for a client. We have these beautiful lines cutting through. Now, this is a real modern mid-century design. There's no turf grass. They have a mass planting like you saw in that previous picture of the sedge. And then we've got these beautiful horizontal lines that as you walk up to the front door, you're walking through these transitions of plant material. But then you have these nice walkways that cut through the garden, so it allows you to venture off. I like to create destinations in gardens so that you're not just limited to one single space. You have other places that you can venture through in that garden. So this gives a lot of structure, a lot of definition. And despite these plants being in lines, you have things like the yucca and the perennial grasses that require zero maintenance during the growing season, but they give you lines without the formality of hedges. And that's what we mean by plant lines, but also lines with edging and lines with walkways as well. Now, unity. Unity comes with kind of bringing harmony, tying things in your garden. And sometimes that can be a repetition or a pattern like you see in this picture. There's a lot going on in this picture, and they're not all native. There is some, Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susans in there that can be classified as native, but this is more of a seasonal type color. But the pattern and the repetition is what I want you to see. Them repeating this pattern throughout this line in this bed is what gives them that definition, and it kind of ties things in, and it can transition out to other parts of a garden. You can see here where we have this fun, this is another recent design, we have this fun walkway going through that creates these little pocket gardens, but it ties in other parts of the garden by providing some unity. So you walk through this central vein through the garden, and you come out to this little pocket fire pit area of the garden, and then you can transition into another room, which is the raised vegetable garden part. And then you even have a secret little area over here, but we're utilizing the same material. So the gravel base of the walkways, the edging, it's all utilizing the same material, which brings some unity and consistency through that garden. Now, contrast and harmony, these are bringing in, I like contrast in a garden. I like real bold contrasts. And we get this both with color and with texture, and I'm going to touch on those next. But you can see this Princess Caroline Napier grass in the background. It's bold. It makes a really big statement in the garden, and that's what I like to see. But it also can bring some harmony. It ties things in. It kind of acts as a centerpiece where everything can flow around it. And it unifies different parts of the garden. And tying in light colors. For example, if I repeated this same color palette on this other side of the grass, that would also bring me some harmony and tie in. So this is where a lot of people struggle with, oh, I want one of everything in my garden. And that can be okay if it's contained and balanced properly. But at the same time, you may not be that person that needs the one of everything. Quit looking at what the Joneses are doing out in the street and do what you need to do. Sometimes less is more. And that's where you can repeat the same plant material throughout a garden. And that's where you can bring harmony and tie things in throughout the garden. But harmony also goes into what we call themed gardens. With themed gardens, the most popular being kind of the Japanese garden. This comes with a big warning tag, because as soon as you steer away from that themed garden, you can lose that themed garden. For example, this Japanese garden in this picture, what if I decided, oh, I went to Canton this last week and I'm going to hang a big Texas star right here, and I'm going to put one of those, metal goats right over here because it'll look really good in front of that shrub. Well, then I've lost that Japanese garden because that has nothing to do with the Japanese garden. So if you choose a themed garden, you need to stick with that garden. As soon as you veer away from that, then you lose that. Now, color. We can have so much fun with color in a garden. This is kind of leaning towards more that monochromatic. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But color evokes the biggest responses with us and has a very powerful response depending on the color with different people. Friends of mine that are psychologists talk about how they use blues in therapy rooms as a soothing color, but they actually can use red to kind of invigorate people, to kind of get responses out of them. Our reds and oranges tend to be our warm colors. They also stand out in the forefront, whereas the blues and greens and even whites are our cooler colors, and they tend to stand out in the background. For example, the one thing you can look at, you see all these blues and purples, but then you see a little bit of orange right here, and it looks like it's the bolder, bigger part of that garden. And I love color in foliage. We can get a lot of contrast with this. This is that rising sun redbud. I'm actually going to show you that here in a little bit when I venture outside in the outdoor portion of my program. And Daniel will talk a little bit about that when he goes into the plant selection, and we'll talk about this plant as well. But it's the boldness of the shape of this leaf and the color that really makes a statement. Here you can see it's also structure and shapes of plants that are different colors, and that lends into the texture. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So texture is where contrasting textures, we have soft textures up against hard textures, or fine and coarse textures, heavy and light, thin and dense, meaning you do thinner plantings next to dense plantings, and then light and shade, like the different lighting that you get. Here you can see that hardscape with the softness of the plants. The plants actually soften that hardscape by providing a real dramatic texture contrast. And then you look at things like these beautiful agaves with that soft Mexican feathergrass, that softening and that contrast. You see every plant individually, and that's really important when you put different texturing or contrasting textures next to each other. And I'll show you some of these outside as well. I like bold textures up against soft textures is my favorite texture contrast in a garden. And then, perennial gardens do lend a lot of different texture by the shapes of leaves. You can see the broader leaves here next to finer leaves. Vertical shapes like this liatris really makes a bold vertical statement and gives definition. And that's where texture really helps out, is that definition. And I love this walkway through this garden. It's also that balance in there. And I'm going to talk about balance as well. And then look at this walkway. You've got the bold textures of the flax back here, even the smoke trees right behind this beautiful soft grass. And those are the contrasting textures. This is something that my parents would kill me for telling you about, but we just finished a renovation in their home. And my parents tend to think that everything needs to match. Like all the furniture needs to match in a garden or in their home. And this also lends to the outdoors as well. And I was trying to explain to them as like accent pieces. So if you think of like in your landscape, accent pieces of furniture or artwork in your garden, those really do give you a lot of texture contrasting. So when you put something that doesn't really match, say you have a modern home and you put an antique in the room, that is a very popular trend where you introduce an antique or a more traditional piece to a modern home so that it stands out. And that's what we want you to do with plants. We want each plant to stand out individually. But if you put all the light textures together, it kind of blends in and creates that green blob. So be dramatic about this, and that's where you'll get that definition. And hardscape, we love hardscape. Hardscape's everything you're not trying to grow, your rock, your sidewalks, your driveways. They lend a lot of different texture, but also different shaped leaves. Even though shade gardening does have a lot of green to it, variegation lends a lot of definition. I'll talk about that later in the program. But you can see every different leaf and plant individually in this shade garden. Now, transitioning. Transitioning is very important in a garden because if you don't transition things smoothly, then it's going to look very odd. This is where hodgepodgey kind of gardens come together, gradually changing plant material. Like, for example, this walkway is going through one portion of the garden, but we're using the same walkway material throughout the entire garden. And that's how we can marry everything together. And that's how we can have that gradual change. Mixing plant material, kind of like a transition where you go from one set of plant material to another set of plant material, but in between those two plant material, we mix them a little bit so that you have this smooth transition. Now, dramatic transitions can be nice as well, where you literally feel like you're going from one room to the next. And that could be walking through a walkway or an arbor or something. And that's how we can separate those two areas. Here you can see we went from one surface to another surface, but these pads kind of fizzling out or phasing into the grass is what gives us that smooth transition. Same thing here. We have different hardscape material, and by blending these together and marrying these here, it makes sense that they transition into each other. There's no step up. There's nothing that's dividing them. By merging these together and blending them and mixing them, that gives us that transition in the garden. Same thing here. We're going from one surface and we want to tie it together using the same walkway, that transition. So I blend in this walkway in with the concrete, and then it goes out to that gravel portion. The plant material can be very similar, and we're transitioning from one sunlight area to a shady area, and that's a nice transition in the garden. Now, proportion. This can be the biggest impact and the most fun that you can have in a garden by providing a large scale. You can see here these beautiful agaves and these very large planters with those palm trees behind them that are just that scale, that real dramatic. And yes, we can have big agaves here. We can have big palm trees here that do really well. Don't always count or plan for another 100-year freeze, because we may not get another 100-year freeze, and we don't want you to think like that. So there's great plant material, palm trees, especially sabal palms that grow real tall like this, that are very hardy and made it through our freeze as well. Proportion can also come with mass plantings. This is where some people like, oh, I like this plant, but I like this plant, and I don't. What do I put with them, or what do I that combination of those two? Well, what if instead of just doing one, you did 10 to have like a mass planting? And that's how you can have a bigger proportion and create a larger scale by doing a little bit more of a mass planting in that garden. It doesn't have to be onesies. It doesn't have to be one of everything in a garden. You may be struggling with that, where you're like, I can't figure out my entire plant selection because I'm trying to figure out all the different plants that I can put in my garden. Well, you're hunting and searching for plants that you may not need. You may only like those 3 plants, and you may have 100 square feet to fill. So what if you did those 3 plants, but in larger mass plantings? And that's where you can clean things up. Mass plantings can actually bring a lot of balance to a garden. And you can see here, you've got the large leaf of those soft-leaf yuccas in the back, the softness of that Mexican feathergrass in the front. It's the different sizes. So this is where we get specimen plants, putting a large tree or something in the forefront to create kind of a specimen really stand out. And that's where a mass planting can help as well. Now, balance. This is something some of y'all may be really searching for in your garden. And balance comes in both a formal and informal garden. Symmetry is something that people tend to think they always have to achieve, but the front of your home, the back of your home may not be symmetrical. And symmetry sometimes is difficult to achieve in that. And we don't always want you to plan for symmetry. You don't have to have 2 plants over here and then have to put 2 plants over here. In fact, in design, we design for odds or multiples of 3. That's just how our brains work. Just like the front elevations of our home are very rarely mirror images or symmetrical. If you take a picture of the front of your home, fold it in half, it doesn't normally match. And that's how we work. We have one eye stronger than the other. Everybody has that. And that's what I mean by we're not symmetrical beings. And so we don't typically look at things that way. So this picture right here, if I fold a picture of this square garden, it will match, and that's symmetrical. But this also still comes with that warning as what happens if that one plant right here dies? That then becomes a focal point. Whereas if it was an asymmetrical garden, then you would have less likely have that problem. Here you can see that symmetry that they've achieved with this beautiful patio, but replicating the same plant material on either side. And that's where you get that symmetry. And it's also symmetrical the other way. You can fold this in half both ways and it would be symmetrical. And that's what we mean by that formal garden. Whereas informal gardens is more about creating balance and creating a flow. And some of y'all that may be those one of everything people in your garden, how do we create that balance? In this garden, we have quite a bit of variety in this garden, and it's asymmetrical. There's no formality to it. It has a nice, soft, natural flow, but our walkway here and even our retaining walls give us that balance. It kind of distracts from that big blob of plants, and that's what we mean by the balance. Here you can see that we've got different plant material on either side of the walkway, and some of it very large scaled. And that's also how we can create some balance, doing more on one side than the other side. And then this is also a balance where I talked about mass planting. So this is some of those sedges. This is a beautiful sedge that I think kind of creates like a wavy forest grass in the garden. And you don't necessarily, this is a very low variety in the garden, but this lowness of that sedge that does not have to be mowed and very rarely has to be watered is a great addition to any garden. Repetition. Repetition is also how we can create some lines in our garden, give us some definition, and it can be simple or it could be very diverse. Just the simple line of this lavender in front of this native landscape with the turf grass gives us definition. It's a little bit of a repetition in the garden, whereas some of y'all might want that variety, but how do we make sense of that variety? And maybe it is, instead of doing 1 of a plant, we do 3 of a plant. Not 2, but 3. Remember, odds are multiples of 3. For example, here you can see they have some of the plant right here, but they added some more in here so that it has more of a bulkiness and more of a presence in the garden. Whereas maybe the trees are just the single, but we have variety throughout the garden, many different types of plants in the garden. Form you can have a lot of fun with. A lot of people are really stuck on some of the vertical columnar plants or even the weeping plants. This picture here, you can see all these beautiful junipers. And we've got some of the ground cover junipers that spread. We have some more of the shrubby type junipers. We have some of those conical shaped junipers, columnar shaped junipers, and even the weeping ones. When you have fun with form, it gives definition because you can see every plant individually. And this can be fun for specimen plant material. Be careful with things like the weeping variety. Some people want to do like a weeping garden and all these different weeping trees and plants in their garden, but I think that could look pretty sad, all that downward motion. Give yourself some vertical motion as well in the garden. But forms also can come with a high maintenance tag. For example, if you're a little bit shear, electric shear, gas shear happy, and you like to create these rounded shapes in your garden, as soon as you start creating a shape on a plant and pruning it for that shape, you have to constantly prune it for that shape so you don't lose that shape. So be careful with form because it can come with that high maintenance tag to it. And then have fun with it like a specimen. You know, this one does not look sad to me. This is a weeping blue atlas cedar. I almost feel like he's going to start walking and talking to me like Mr. Snuffleupagus would. So it can be a beautiful specimen, but still give you a lot of definition. You can still see all the plants around it and behind it individually. The whole key to this whole thing is we want you to think outside the box. Quit looking and seeing what the Joneses are doing or what the builders are doing in the gardens, and try to create something different for yourself. And we can help you with that as well. But have fun with this. Just make sure you're giving yourself structure and definition in the garden, and you will be successful with it.
Now, the first plant I want to talk about is an ornamental tree that's one of my favorites. And these are the redbuds. They're redbuds that are indigenous to Texas and Oklahoma and Mexico. Also, those eastern redbuds indigenous to the eastern half of the state. Now, they're all have the same genus and species, very closely related. They're all going to have these beautiful pink blooms in the spring before the leaves arise. But there's a lot of cultivars that are really impressive now that have been bred to have foliage that looks great year round. So same heart-shaped flowers we see in our traditional native redbuds, but these nativars like the rising sun have oranges and yellows and lime greens. In fact, this is what the one looks like in my landscape right now. Just so striking, work well in full sun to full shade, and are great for people and wildlife alike. Just look at how amazing that plant is. They typically get about 12 foot tall or so, 12 to 15 feet tall, maybe 8 to 9 feet wide. And again, for most of the growing season, you're going to see some vibrant colors. There's also some other redbuds like the forest pansy, the merlot, and the ruby falls that have maroon leaves. Again, these are going to do quite well as ornamental trees in full sun to full shade. The forest pansy gets a little bit taller. The ruby falls is kind of more compact with that weeping foliage. And there are some like the vanilla twist that actually have white blooms instead of those traditional pink blooms, but it's going to give you that same maroon color. Now, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of people with kind of these Italian cypress that are sick recently. We don't really recommend planting that tree because they just don't seem to do well in our area in recent years. But there are plenty of native plants that do well that kind of fill that same niche. And so these are our cultivars of our native Rocky Mountain juniper, Juniperus scopulorum. Blue Arrow is one of my favorites that has kind of that gray-green foliage, gets about 12 to 15 feet tall, but not very wide, so it has kind of a nice columnar form. There's also a gray gleam juniper that is very similar. It's just got more of a gray or gray-blue leaf to it. There's also skyrocket juniper. Oh, this one's going to get quite a bit taller, up to 20 feet, but it's going to stay very compact. So this one only gets 2 to 3 feet wide. So if you really need some vertical space, maybe as a screen or a windbreak, that could be a great choice for you. There's also some more kind of Christmas tree shaped forms too. And so Moonglow is one that it could get, about 15 feet tall or so, but it gets quite a bit wider. So, 5 to 6 feet wide. So it does have that more Christmas tree shape if that's what you're interested in. Now, we also have some native kind of understory trees. Most folks are familiar with our Yaupon holly, whose females have the red berries, but also they have the evergreen foliage that persists through the year. It's a great ornamental tree for full sun to dense shade. And then there is the ilex, or that's the genus of the possum haw and the Yaupon. But the possum haw holly is a close cousin whose females have the bright red berries, but they actually lose their leaves in the winter. And so it's really nice over the holiday season. They're also great for many of our songbirds like the cedar waxwings, but again, going to do great in full sun to full shade conditions. Another plant that you may be interested in are some of the succulents that are native to Texas. And there are nativars, which is basically just a cultivar of a native plant that says the same genus and species. It's just been selected because it's got more incredible attributes. So the brake lights, red yucca, the hesperallos are amazing kind of a little bit more compact than the traditional red yuccas and have a bright red bloom on there. The color guard yucca is a cultivar of our native Yucca filamentosa, which normally has a green leaf and beautiful white blooms, but instead this one is going to have a yellow stripe in the center, so yellow variegation there. And as we see cooler temperatures in the fall and the winter, it's evergreen, but you'll notice that that yellow stripe kind of transitions to some reds and pinks and oranges, which is just amazing. It's a very, very popular plant, ornamental plant for the landscape. If you're interested in true kind of opuntias or cactus, you may look at this Santa Rita. And the Santa Rita is one that is native to kind of the Big Bend region, but is cold hardy to our area, kind of protected. You want to make sure it has good soil and maybe incorporating decomposed granite or gravel into that soil to improve the drainage. Plant it a little bit higher up so it's on a slope where that extra moisture can wash away. But beautiful kind of purple tones to the pads, as well as large blooms that are yellow, which are very striking. Another succulent you may want to look at that is a cultivar of a native. This is a native agave that is indigenous to kind of the coastal region of Texas, but this one's called center stripe agave. And you'll notice that it has variegation down the center of that leaf, which is kind of more lime green, very striking. I have these planted in my own yard, did very well with the freeze that we had in February. There's also a quad color, which has kind of 4 different color stripes down there that you may be interested in. But some interesting things that work well in well-draining full sun spots in our landscape and are probably beyond what you would imagine in native yucca and cacti and agave. Now, I mentioned the Yaupon hollies earlier, but there are improved versions of those Yaupon hollies as well. This one is a weeping form on the left, which has long arching branches, still the same evergreen foliage. This one does have a red berry because it's a female cultivar. They're beautiful as specimens. So plants, maybe planting out a window or when you're walking away a pathway to kind of get that aha moment. There's also Scarlet's Peak, which is a more columnar form of a Yaupon. So it only gets 2 to 3 feet wide, still has that same evergreen foliage. And this one is a female cultivar as well. So you'll have the red berries. Now, a male cultivar that is of its own interest is the Micron, and this one is very compact. It only gets about 2 foot by 2 foot at maturity, but it has very, very small, fine leaves on it. Works very well, maybe as a border plant, it's evergreen, or maybe as the second level in a layering. You plant something smaller in front of it, but provides year-round interest. And again, extremely well adapted to our area because it is a native. I wanted to dig deeper into some of our favorite grasses, which add movement and along with variations in texture, form, and color, and are really hot in terms of landscape design and plant selection. So our muleys are very hot right now. Gulf muley. This one has really open panicle or inflorescence that are pink and kind of dance in the wind, and they look good pretty much 11 months out of the year. There's also their cousin, which is the cultivar White Cloud, same genus and species, but this one, instead of having the pink inflorescence, has white inflorescence. I love planting those close together so you can really see the combinations or the juxtaposition of the pink and the white together. There's also our pine muleys, which is kind of a more compact version of the Lindheimer muleys. It's kind of got these straight kind of hairs that come up and beautiful yellow inflorescence when they bloom. But these get about 2 foot by 2 foot and really are kind of nice for those smaller spots, maybe where you would have normally Mexican feathergrass, another option there. All these grasses work well from full sun to part sun, so they do very well in kind of those hot spots on the west side or just anywhere in the landscape that are sunnier to give a little bit of contrast and texture and form. Other grasses you may want to look at are the Blonde Ambition blue grama grass, which looks like it's got the little flags that kind of dance in the wind. This one gets about 2 foot by 2 foot or so. There are a number of little blue stems on the market, improved cultivars. This little munchkin is more compact. There's also standing ovation, which is really a neat one that gets a little bit taller, but is more upright and cylindrical, or kind of doesn't get as wide and bushy. There's also larger ornamental grasses like our native switchgrass Dallas Blues, which has a thicker leaf blade, really neat kind of blue greens, but are very striking in a landscape as either a specimen or perhaps in a group planting to break up form and texture contrast. Some other new grasses to look at are the black hawk, a big blue stem. And so we've seen a lot of these purple grasses or darker grasses on the market, some of them native, some of them adapted. But the big blue stem is a native to our area and has really interesting foliage. And then the blooms are very contrasting, so kind of a yellow to white bloom on there. We also have our tried and true Mexican feathergrass and inland sea oats. Both of these are extremely vigorous grasses, so they can cover a lot of ground if you need to kind of stabilize soil. Inland sea oats works very well, full sun to full shade. Mexican feathergrass does better in kind of full sun to part shade. And then a big blue stem is more of those full sun grasses. But some great option there. You may also want to dig into the salvias, or also known as the true sages. So our native Salvia farinaceae, the Greg Grant selection, Henry Duelberg is really great, that has both purple flowers and purple calyx, or the Augusta Duelberg version of that has kind of blue, light blue, gray blue colors in both the calyx and the flower. There's also new autumn sages like the coral. It's on the market. Traditionally, our native autumn sage was in hot pinks, and now there are purples and yellows and reds and whites and all different colors under the sun. The sun, very beneficial in terms of just long bloomers, can bloom spring, summer, into fall, but also attract hummingbirds and butterflies and really give back. There are also some hybrids with the autumn sage. This one right here is called Hot Lips, which is a hybrid between Salvia microphylla, native to South America, and then our Salvia gregii, or autumn sage that we just talked about. But this has interesting flowers that kind of start off white, and as it gets hotter, they transition to the bottom part of them red, which is how they get their name Hot Lips. It's like they put their lipstick on, but really a striking plant. Again, native to a combination, a hybrid of two plants, native to the Americas, but interesting. Now, this is a plant that some people have a love and hate relationship, but I'm one that really loves this plant for spots that have really dense shade, spots with bare soil. Maybe it's along a pathway that stays muddy and nothing seems to want to grow there. This is a bulletproof plant for those spots that, if you let grow, will actually kind of create a really nice ground cover. This one is a cultivar of lyre leaf sage called Purple Volcano, which has pretty much all purple leaves. And I find this to be less aggressive than its native cousin that has kind of just the dark purple midrib. This is a cultivar of that native Salvia lyrata. Now, it also has beautiful light blue to purple blooms. And after those blooms are spent, if you cut them off, that will prevent reseeding. But if you want it to reseed and kind of form a ground cover, certainly you can allow it to do so as well. Texas Gold Columbine is another great perennial that works well in shady spots, full shade, dense shade, part shade. It's going to have beautiful spring blooms that are yellow, gets about 3 foot by 3 foot. And then after it's done blooming, it has really nice kind of dainty fern-like foliage, but another one of my favorite native plants for low light conditions. I talked a little bit about yuccas, but one yucca that we really love is the softleaf yucca, the yucca whose leaves kind of bend over like this. And it works well, full sun, down to part shade, maybe even full shade. It can handle more shade than you might think. It puts spikes of beautiful white blooms, evergreen kind of foliage that provides nice structure in the landscape. So make a note of that one if you're looking for that yucca type foliage in lower light conditions. Another plant that can fill that niche is the dwarf palmetto. So a lot of people are surprised to find that this dwarf palm is actually native to north central Texas, extremely cold hardy, can get 6 by 6 foot tall and wide. A lot of times it's kind of more in the 4 foot by 4 foot range. Works well in full sun down to full shade, but really nice palm fronds that add contrast and structure. A lot of people like these by a water feature or a pool to kind of invoke that little kind of water or beachfront feel. There's also Greg's Mistflower. And this is a plant that if you want to attract monarch butterflies or the queen butterflies, viceroys, like we see pictured here, this may be something that you want to go ahead and incorporate as soon as possible, because when it blooms in the fall, it is going to attract all different types of butterflies to your landscape, as well as a number of other pollinators. In fact, it's not unusual for me to go check out this plant blooming and see dozens and dozens of different species using it as a nectar source. There's also the Carolina cherry laurel. So if you're looking for a native kind of small tree, large shrub, there's compact forms of these that have evergreen foliage. They work well as a windbreak or as a noise barrier. Extremely ornamental in terms of their glossy green foliage. They also have interesting white blooms, sweet smelling blooms in the spring that a number of our native bees will use. And then those give rise to a drupe or a little seed that a number of our songbirds will use as well. Carolina's cherry laurel works well in full sun to full shade. Now, another ornamental tree that works very well in really droughty kind of full sun conditions is the desert willow. And these are going to produce flowers most through the summer, big orchid-like flowers that are great for hummingbirds and bees, just very striking plants for kind of those hot spot, well-draining areas of your landscape. This says Texas mountain laurel, but clearly this is not a Texas mountain laurel. This is a Turk's cap. So we have the giant Turk's cap kind of picture on the left. We have the pink traditional Turk's cap picture on the right. These plants thrive in spots with low light conditions. They really work well in kind of shady corners, behind trees, spots where it seems like nothing else really wants to grow. And not only are they great for hummingbirds, but they're also a great nectar source for a number of butterflies, and they produce a fruit that is also eaten by wildlife. Now, Texas sage is a great shrub for full sun spots, well-draining soil. There's a number of them that bloom either purple blooms or white blooms. There's some like green cloud that have green foliage, or like the Silverado here that has kind of that gray-green foliage. But just a striking evergreen shrub, does need full sun and well-draining soil. But if you give it that, every time we get a rain event in the summer, you're going to see a new flush of blooms. Now here's our Texas mountain laurel. Now this is a large shrub, a small tree. It's one of the first things to bloom in the spring, and its clusters of purple flowers are intoxicating, smelling like grape Kool-Aid or grape jelly. Just a beautiful plant that also is great for attracting a number of pollinators. It does have evergreen foliage, works well in full sun to park shade. So it does need well-draining soil, but has a lot of adaptability at different spots in our landscape. Texas rock rose is another one of my favorite plants. And this is one that is one of our smaller native hibiscus. It gets about 3 foot by 3 foot wide and tall. It does have bright pink blooms with yellow centers. A number of our butterflies and bees will actually utilize this for a nectar and pollen source. This does well in full sun down to, I would say, full shade, part shade. It does also handle wet feet as well as really dry conditions. So dwarf wax myrtle is another plant of particular interest. It's evergreen. This one could be in a shrub form or a tree form. If you want to limit up, it will look more like a tree. There's the dwarf wax myrtle that works very well as kind of a screen. You can even hedge it if you want to, just cutting it back a little bit once a year to create a little bit more dense form of shrubbery. but it is super drought tolerant, but can handle wet feet, very versatile, being able to be planted in full sun to full shade. It also has a waxy berry that many of our songbirds like as well. American beautyberry is a shrub that is adaptable to as dense a sunlight conditions as you could give it. So works very well in dense shade, kind of gets 4 foot by 4 foot long arching branches that produce these magenta berries and fall through the winter season. A number of our native songbirds and wildlife will use these as a food source when things are kind of slim. It will also handle sunnier spots. So, full sun down to full shade, very, very adaptable shrub. Flame acanthus is another shrub that I really like. The other name for this one is hummingbird bush, for its propensity to attract hummingbirds to the landscape. It has kind of these really deeply throated red flowers that hummingbirds are adapted to getting the nectar from, as well as many of our butterflies. And when this thing is covered in blooms in the summer, it's extremely striking, getting 3 foot by 3 foot or 4 foot by 4 foot or so. But something to think about. There's also the Benny's Gold, which is a version of this one that instead of having red flowers, more is kind of the yellow to orange spectrum. Gara is a perennial that it kind of functions like a shrub in a landscape. It's more of a herbaceous perennial, so it has kind of that soft texture and leaves, but very large arching flowers. And they could get 3 foot by 3 foot. It depends on the cultivar. Some of them have more of a white flower. Some of them have more of a pink flower here. But because they really have those large stems at the base of the flower, they kind of tend to dance in the wind and add movement. But another great native plant for full sun down to part shade conditions. If you're looking for something that blooms in the fall, look no further than the fall aster. Now, some of these actually bloom in the spring this year, but it's an evergreen kind of subshrub, about 3 foot by 3 foot range. It will handle full sun down to part shade, maybe even full shade if it's getting western sun. They have striking blue daisy-like flowers, and then the centers, the flowers are yellow, and so nice contrast there with the purple and the gold. And these will bloom, in the fall very densely, but sometimes those blooms will persist, November, December, even through January if it doesn't get that cold. So it's great at providing a nectar source for insects, even in the cooler weather. Echinacea, or purple coneflower, I know is one that a lot of folks are familiar with, but there's many native species that grow well in our area. Huge flowers. Primarily, these are going to bloom in the spring and the summer. You can deadhead them or cut off the tops of the spit flowers, and you may get some reblooming in the fall, depending on the cultivar or the species you've got. But you can leave those seed heads as well, and it is going to be a food source for a number of birds. So some benefits any way you look at it. Another coneflower of particular interest are the rudbeckias. In that pollinator pack, we've included a Sundance rudbeckia, but there are a number of rudbeckias or black-eyed Susans that are adaptable to our area that bloom, kind of have some overlap, bloom in the summer, with our echinacea there, but just striking yellow to kind of gold blooms. And again, their seed heads are a food source for a number of our songbirds. Looking for something to thrive in full sun spot where nothing else will grow. If it's a spot that it's hard to irrigate, or maybe it's near kind of a rocky area or driveway, this plant cannot be beat for the hot, dry spots with good drainage. In fact, it really doesn't like water. And so if you water this one too much, it may actually be a detriment to the plant. But in those sunny spots that don't hold water, this plant is great. If you're trying to plant these and you've had problems with them, incorporate some gravel or decomposed granite, maybe a little bit of sandy loam into the soil so it does drain, and let that water to kind of wash away from the roots. You could actually put even some larger rocks around there so the foliage doesn't lay on the ground and kind of stay wet, and it'll be a lot more happy. Another great perennial. This is a plant that grows well as a border around edges, similar to where you would put the Blackfoot daisy. This one's right skullcap, so you can get up to 18 inches by 18 inches or so. Sometimes it stays a little bit more compact. It has purple blooms that persist through the summer, works very well in full sun to part sun conditions. If you're looking for a viney native plant, a cross vine has got to be one of my favorites. It's one of the first things to kind of pop up and bloom in the spring, and huge flowers. It's densely covered. You may also see just kind of sporadic blooms through the summer and fall as well. A nectar source for hummingbird as well as a number of bees. It's great on arbors, and it's a lot better than its cousin, the trumpet vine. It's not as aggressive. So if you see an orange flower and you think, oh, that's aggressive, don't get it confused with our other native trumpet vine. Cross vine is not nearly as aggressive and is well kept. Another vine you may want to dig into is the coral honeysuckle. So again, they tend to bloom in early spring. Sometimes you can get subsequent blooms through the growing season. Typically, they're going to come in red, deeply throated flowers, work kind of well on edges, part sun to part shade, and are very attractive to a number of our native hummingbirds. Now, this is another great plant that works well either as a ground cover or a border plant. This one's called snake herb. So it's a native plant that looks very similar to rosemary, has purple blooms, and a semi-evergreen foliage, especially in mild winters. But you may see it, when it's growing, it kind of looks like a ground cover rosemary, but is actually a native plant, does very well in full sun to part shade. Another great ground cover plant that's a native is our frog fruit. There's a number of species and different cultivars of frog fruit out there, but primarily these are going to grow kind of 6 to 8 inches tall. They will kind of take over and form a ground cover in full sun, full shade areas, anywhere in between. It could be dry spots. It could be kind of lower spots that stay wet after we've got a rainfall event. They have beautiful blooms. The blooms are attractive to a number of our pollinators, butterflies, and bees. It's actually a host species of one of our native butterflies. So this works well in spots where maybe you had turf grass and the turf grass is eroding because it's not enough sunlight or maybe too much moisture or too little moisture. You can mow it a couple times a year and it really has kind of a nice ground cover feel. And this is a plant that is native to North America. It's not native to Texas. It's actually native to one county just east of Texas on the Louisiana side, but very well adapted to, just an hour or two east here in the DFW Metroplex. This one is going to have huge blooms, even bigger than our Asian hydrangeas that we don't necessarily recommend planting. It's adaptable to our alkaline soils, which we don't see with our other hydrangeas. It's semi-evergreen, meaning that in mild winters, the leaves are going to hang on to the plant and they turn bright red. So it's just amazing. The blooms themselves are amazing. The foliage is amazing. And the foliage will look good, 11 months out of the year. So until we get a hard freeze, this is what you're going to see, these kind of bright red purples and maroons and burgundies all throughout there. And even the flowers themselves will kind of dry on the plant and persist, adding ornamental interest pretty much year round. Now, in addition to the plants we've talked about, and Patrick's going to talk about more coming up here, you may also want to incorporate different native seed mixes. There are a lot of annual and perennial wildflowers that you can plant by seeds in a micro meadow or a pocket prairie, which really add a lot. This could be something that is kind of just a blank spot in between your perennials, or maybe it's a larger area that you want to vegetate more inexpensively. But not only are wildflowers just great to look at and enjoy spring, summer, there's some that bloom in the fall, but it's a great way to provide a nectar source and attract those butterflies and hummingbirds into your landscape. But again, look at some of our native seed suppliers and find native seed mixes, that's key, that are adaptable to North Central Texas. Now, we talked a little bit about combinations and layering, but I wanted to bring Patrick back to talk about grouping plants in different combinations based on their sunlight needs, their water needs, their soil and nutrient needs, as well as the tolerance of all the different challenges that we have in North Central Texas, and really to dispel the myths that native plants all look ugly or unkept or weedy. If you're putting them in the right combinations in a setting, paying attention to those ornamental design principles, I think you can create it as beautiful landscape, if not more so, in a landscape that functions with our native ecosystem and ecology.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. Now we are here in my garden. I'm going to do a brief video, show you some of the plants that I've added to my garden that are native. And then we'll head inside and I'll go over some other fun little color and combinations, things like that that we use in our landscapes that can be a lot of fun. But I like to kind of show you my front yard. If you notice, there's no turf grass. That's something I chose to do. I have a lot of shade. I have some great, beautiful oaks that shade out everything above me. I do like my shade gardening. And so what I have here is I have a sedge. This is particular Berkeley sedge, but there's some great native sedges like Texas sedge that create, like you see behind me, kind of a mounding, kind of wavy forest grass instead of something I have to mow and water. I don't water. We've had a lot of rain, especially over this weekend. And so my landscape depends a lot on that rainwater and not on me with my irrigation system. I do know the front irrigation zone does work. There's 3 up here. I've done my irrigation checks, which is something that we highly recommend you do every month that you're doing it. And you heard me talking on some of the design principles, some of the fun things like scale and using things like artwork. You can see here I've created a piece for my front yard that really stands out and gives me some different texture in my landscape. It doesn't all have to be greenery. And then in my front planters right here, I have some of the great agaves that you will hear or heard Daniel talk about. Like this is a blue whale's tongue agave. It's a smaller, younger one, but I'll kind of zoom up so you can get a better look of him. Oops, I'm getting used to this new Kimball we have here. You can see here that beautiful silver blue foliage. And then underneath it, I have that great Angeline sedum, which is a great contrast and texture variance in the landscape. So we'll have a lot of fun with plants, have a lot of fun with contrasting textures. Don't make everything just a green blob out there. That's not what we want you to do. We want you to have fun with this. And you know, we're talking about natives today. That's one of the big focuses we wanted to focus on. But one of the things you will notice in my landscape is I also have a lot of adaptives. I have a lot of different new varieties and species of plants that you can have a lot of fun with. But the other smaller shrub that I have added to my garden recently is a dwarf yaupon. Now this particular dwarf yaupon is called micron leaf. The leaves are very small. The plant itself stays at about 18 inches by 18 inches, so it stays really small. And then you'll notice in the background over there, I have a dwarf palmetto. So not all palms get trunks and clear trunks out there. This one stays more of a shrub. So it can get about 6 feet by 6 feet, but it adds a lot of contrasting texture to the garden. And it's another great versatile plant. It really doesn't care whether you plant it in the full sun or full shade. It will grow a little faster in that full sun, but it does great. In fact, in its native environment, it grows naturally under the shade of a lot of our larger trees. And then here we have some of our salvias. Salvias are great for our pollinators, our bees, and our butterflies. The rain, this thing's starting to pick back up. I've recently added Texas lantana to my garden. Now, lantana is one of our #1 nectar plants, especially for monarchs in the garden. So I really do love my lantanas. And then I even have a newer variety of a rudbeckia. So rudbeckia, as you know, is kind of black-eyed Susans. This particular one has kind of a spikier leaf. It looked better prior to the rain. It got a little beat up with all the rain we've had, but you can see how the blooms, the petals are a little different than other black-eyed Susans. But this combination, as you can see, and I have a coneflower right over there. It's a newer variety of coneflower called Cheyenne Sunset. And this combination of the oranges and the yellows of the coneflower, the rudbeckia, and the lantana, these are all some of our warmer tones.
So they really stand out in the forefront, whereas your blues, things like that, and I'm gonna go over all this in just a minute with you inside. Those colors are blues and greens and whites are usually in the background. They give a little bit more depth to the garden, where your reds and your oranges, things like that, really stand out in the forefront and can give you a lot of texture and variance. And you'll also see the rain barrel. This barrel is actually going to be in our rain barrel video that you will be able to view here very shortly. It's overflowing with all the rain that we've had. It's overflowing. I need to get some of that water off the top of my barrel. That water that's on that rain barrel actually supplies my water feature. Yes, I have a water feature, and it's really meant more for my pollinators. I'm entering my side garden right now. My side garden is a little bit more of a shade garden, and I like to show you a lot of versatile plants, because so many people struggle with, well, do I have sun, do I have shade? And if you really don't have a lot of knowledge as for what sun your certain area of your home gets, and you really, it's kind of a little bit of a guessing game, a lot of these versatile plants will make you more successful with that. So one of the plants that you saw Daniel go over, which is absolutely one of my favorite plants, is Turk's Cap. This particular one is pink Turk's Cap. I do have a red one in the backyard that I'll show you here very shortly. These guys are very quick growers. They do well from sun to shade. These particular ones are only getting part sun. They do get quite a bit of sun here later in the afternoon. But I really do love this plant. And if you're a hummingbird attractor, this is a must in your garden. You really have to have this for your garden. And then surprisingly, another great plant that does well in the shade is some of our softleaf yuccas. You see that little cicada shell right there in the garden? So softleaf yuccas, and this particular one is a variegated softleaf yucca, and it's a fairly young one. This one's only about 24 inches tall and wide right now. Look at the contrast between the foliage of the Turk's Cap behind it and then the foliage of the yucca in front of it. This is a contrast. These are those contrasting textures that we talked about that really gives you definition in the garden. So trying to keep opposite shapes, sizes, and colors of foliage gives you that definition that some people struggle with and end up with just kind of a green blob in their garden. So really getting dramatic contrast like this really helps. Another plant that will give you a lot of contrast, and some plants that still have yet to be planted, is cast iron plant. Cast iron plant is one of my absolute favorite plants. It is a shade lover. It can handle some morning sun, but for the most part, it likes the shade. And I'm going to show you, and really shortly, I'm going to show you some, excuse me, other variegated plants. Variegation adds a lot to your garden, and I just showed you the cast iron plant, so I'm kind of rushing over because I wanted to show you its brother, which is the variegated cast iron plant. And I'm going to talk to you about variegated plants. I have a lot of variegated plants in my garden. Really love them, especially in the evenings and at night, but also in dark spots. This is a really dark spot by my water feature. This is what that rain barrel supplies. I don't use city water to fill it, but it also supplies water to my pollinators. And this variegation is in a really dark spot. Another plant that I do get a lot of variegation off of is the newer variegated varieties of the Aurelia. This particular one is brand new in my garden, and it's called Spiderweb, and you can see that variegation out there. So now I'm going to head back to that shade garden. This is what I want to show you right here. So the oak leaf hydrangeas really do give us a lot of contrasting texture. Look how large this leaf is. And then look at this bloom. So this particular one is called Munchkin. The blooms can, depending on the rainfall we get and the acidity that from the rain that we get, I don't fertilize all of these. It can be more white, but you can see here it has a little bit more pink. And I do believe that is because of we've had a higher than normal rainfall in some parts of this year. We're still about average. We're not below or above, really. We're still kind of, I think, sitting about average right now. And of course, in the shade also, I've added some more of those palmettos. So I have some new palmettos in this shade garden to kind of help out because it is very dark. This is the north side of my fence, and as you can see behind me, it's very narrow. It's only 8 feet wide. but I kind of like to make it a destination. It's a walking through garden, see the pathway. It's very young. It's a brand new garden in my landscape, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. But now we're gonna hear some really loud traffic because I'm going to the back of my house. The back of my house is where we have a lot of fun with especially agaves. Something that a lot of people don't always consider in their gardens are a lot of the fun agaves with that silver foliage, variegated foliage. One of the kins to our pink rock rose is the Brazilian rock rose. This has got a really pretty white bloom with that blood red center to it. This guy didn't make it through the freeze. It froze back, but it came back from the root. And then unfortunately the rain did really kind of beat up some of my plants, but this is Zexminia, a wonderful yellow combination, but I like that contrast with the yellows and the pinks. And yes, I do have some prickly pear in my gardens as well. Love prickly pears. Those also provide a lot of contrast that some people are missing in their garden. So I'm gonna head into the backyard now and show you some other fun plants that we've added to the garden. Not all of them being native, some a lot of adaptive, but I have a wonderful array of perennials because I'm a big perennial gardener. I love my pollinators, and we do get a lot more pollinators on our perennials than we do really anything else, but I just want you to kind of see. Now, yes, I'm a professional plant addict, don't forget about it, me and Daniel both. But you can see the definition, the contrasting colors, the contrasting textures. You can see every plant individually in my garden. There are some spots that late in the season, like right now, do look kind of like a green blob. As temperatures start cooling down, usually 1st of September, I give some things a little bit of a haircut to get some flushed new growth in the garden and get them to kind of recover from the heat, because even our most heat and drought tolerant plants can get beat up in the heat a little bit. And they just need a little bit of a TLC to recover. Now, one of the more popular shrub tree forms that we have in our gardens are the Texas mountain laurels. This particular one is a green Texas mountain laurel, has that beautiful purple bloom that people say, you know, taste, or it's not taste, smells like great pixie sticks kind of smell and taste as well. This is one of my favorites. I'm going to show you a newer variety of the Texas mountain laurel called Silver Peso. Silver Peso has a silver foliage to it. You can see right here. So this is another Texas mountain laurel, but it's got that silver foliage, but it still has that deep purple bloom to it. It's beautiful when it blooms. So this is a contrasting, these are those silvers that I'm gonna talk to you about in just a second, because right in front of it, planted, I have my Henry Dulberg salvia with my Texas mountain laurel, that purple and silver. I love purple silver contrasting in my texture. And right in front of my Henry Dulberg is pink skullcap, and then right there is our native skullcap, the right skullcap. So I have a lot of the purples and silvers, and that's kind of a monochromatic texture in your garden, and I'm going to talk to you about that here very shortly as well. I love monochromatic gardens. I feel like they have a real big punch to them, can be very dramatic in the garden. So I like that variations in my garden. Now, I did show you, I'm just going to kind of quickly show you the pink Turk's cap that I had in the shade, and I have the red Turk's cap over here in the sun. And that's, again, another great pollinator attractor, especially our hummingbirds in the garden. I did show during 4th of July a red, white, and blue picture, which is a great perennial combination. I have my blue-black salvia, my native salvia gregii, the red, and then I have Snow Hill Nemorosa salvia, which is a dwarf. So I have a tiering, it kind of mounds itself up from there. And you can see how I did that red, white, and blue for the holidays. I hope this new gimbal that we're trying out isn't making everybody a little motion sick. And then the other thing I kind of want to show you is going back to some of those Rudbeckias, the black-eyed Susans. Again, these are a little beat up from the shower we had, but I love yellows and whites together. Behind it is not a native. This is our Diana Rose of Sharon. Not native, but it does provide a lot of contrasting texture because it has those really big white blooms on it. Many different Rose of Sharon's in my garden that I do love. I have some flame acanthus back over here, but this is the one I want to show you after the rainfall, is the Texas sage that's blooming. Have a lot of Texas sage blooming, and again, another monochromatic. I have what's a Salvia gregii that's actually called blue Salvia gregii. The blooms look a little bit more bluish than they do purple. We don't really have true blues, but I wanted you to see that silver foliage up against this. That's a wonderful texture contrast in there. And I'm going to touch a little bit on the silvers for your garden. That's the silver is the 2021 color of the year. And it gives you a lot of depth in your garden because it contrasts off a lot of that foliage and gives you that variations in the garden. Gonna head inside really quick so that we can talk a little bit more about some of the colors and the combinations. And I'm gonna do that on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. It's so inspiring just to hear about all the different ways that you can contrast colors and textures and form. And really, I think it's easier for people to delve into once you kind of go over those principles. There's a lot of light bulbs, I think, that were going off in that last section. Now, also what's inspiring for me is to look at some landscape designers in the industry and some of those other landscape aficionados that kind of think about a holistic approach to landscape design. And one that has really inspired me lately is Pete Aldolf, who is a Dutch garden designer and really has coined what we call the new perennial movement. I wanted to just touch on his projects briefly. But what Pete does many times is create those hardscape areas, those patios and pathways that are very defined spaces. But then in between those spaces, he creates just these works of art that are, it's like instead of a paintbrush as strokes, he's actually using plants as his palette and different colors and textures there to invoke all different types of feelings. Now, his landscapes may look a little bit more natural and wild, but really what he tries to do is create the perfect meadow, the meadow that you would imagine you're hiking and you walk over a hill, maybe it's early morning, the sun's rising, and it's just like this, the sky opens up and the angels are singing and sun shining down on that meadow. It may not be something that you would see actually in a natural area. It's something that has really been intentionally designed with those color and texture contrasts to look their best. He repeats the same colors and the same plant material, picking plants that work well together in terms of combination. I know Patrick will talk about that more here in a little bit. And plants that look good season after season, whether that's spring, summer, fall, or winter. Now, one of the gardens that Pete Aldolf designed that I really like is the High Line in New York. And this is, if you're not familiar, it's kind of a bridge, a track that was defunct. And so they were no longer using that train trestle. And so they actually designed that to a city park that is planted with all different types of native and adapted plants. And people can walk in an urban area and really take advantage of those. But Pete is very intentional about designing gardens that not only look great in the spring, they typically look at their peak in the summer when it's hotter, we're dealing with drought, all different types of colorful blooms that are great for people to enjoy as well as pollinators. And then gardens that look great in the fall as well. So those different textures and movement and colors as they transition through the season. But the other thing that's really critical about his designs is designing things that look good through the winter. So many of the seed heads, they leave intact. And so it adds a visual interest year round, as we transition to December, January, February. Not only is that of special interest for people to look at, but also there are birds that use those seeds to help, have fat resources for the winter, or insects that can kind of overwinter in that plant material. So something to think about in your own landscape as you're transitioning to native plants and you want something that looks beautiful as well as something that is actually functional for our ecosystem. Pete Aldolf has some great designs to dig into. In fact, some that are really, I think, adaptable to a home scale, which a lot of people are certainly interested in doing. Another designer that has a book that I really have become fond of is Thomas Rainier and his partner Claudia West, and their book is called Planting in a Post-Wild World, Designing Plant Communities for Resilient Landscapes. And they really try and incorporate as many native plants as possible, but doing it in a way that is really ornamental with kind of natural flows and feels, but still functional from a standpoint of kind of a native ecosystem. Now, many of the times their designs are going to start with kind of a structural layer, or plants that are, maybe these are woody perennials, or these are, shrubs, trees, what have you. But they're going to kind of add the structure, the forms of the landscape that are going to be there season after season. And then they do have what we call a seasonal theme layer. So there could be plants that they typically kind of bloom in spring, and then they kind of fade and let another plant rise up that blooms in the summer, and then other plants that kind of rise up and bloom in the fall. And so it's kind of this crescendo or this dance of all different types of plants. Some may bloom spring to summer, some may bloom summer to fall, some may bloom spring, summer, and fall, but there's always kind of something going on. Typically these plants are selected because they naturally kind of grow in the same environment, and that they work well together. So some plants may be a little bit shorter, some plants may be a little bit taller, some plants may have a more fibrous root system, some may have a tap root, but these are plants that can kind of take advantage of their own niche in the landscape. And then he always has a ground cover layer. So we always recommend 2 to 4 inches of mulch, and I think that's great. But many times, sometimes if you're not mulching enough, different weeding plants can kind of get in there and take over. And so what Thomas Rainier and Claudia West like to do is plant living mulches that kind of grow densely and will shade out or outcompete any of those weedy species that can pop in. So we see traditional plantings here on the left with those mulch layers, and these plants are young, and it's takes some time for them to establish. So instead of waiting for them to kind of jump up, there are other plants incorporated in the design on the right that really kind of block out any of those bare soil areas, stopping erosion. So something you may want to dig a little bit deeper reading their book. Now, I know one of the benefits we've talked about with native plants is their benefit to pollinators and native wildlife, and adding that fourth dimension to a landscape that really brings our landscapes to life with activity. And Doug Tallamy wrote a book that is fascinating called Bringing Nature Home, about how to do exactly that, how to attract wildlife to your landscape with plenty of nectar plants, plants that are host species for a variety of different butterflies. They actually lay their eggs on that species, and then their caterpillars will eat that and finish their life cycle as a chrysalis. You also want to have food for songbirds and different native grasses that birds can use for nesting material and insects can use for cover. And there's really, the sky is the limit with the diversity of colors and textures you can use with pollinator-friendly plants. You also may want to incorporate water in your landscape for the benefit of wildlife, whether that is dry riverbeds or arroyos or those pervious hardscapes that will help infiltrate that water. Bees and butterflies can use wet stones and little puddles for water sources, but the sky's the limit, whether it's birds or insects, other beneficial insects or wildlife that will really show up in your landscape if you do provide that water source. And then again, we talked about then you're getting the benefits to storm water as well. Now, if you do have a goal of attracting wildlife to your landscape, there are some other considerations, and one of those is the impact of pesticides and fertilizers. We always want to apply those things per label instruction in a method that we call IPM, or integrated pest management. And what integrated pest management does is kind of a holistic approach where if we see some type of pest, the first thing we want to do is identify it, because it may not be the caterpillar of a pest insect. It may actually be a caterpillar of something that is beneficial. And a lot of times you'll hear native plant enthusiasts say, if something is not eating your plant is not part of the ecosystem. And so on my passion vine, I actually see little, gold fritillary, Mexican fritillary caterpillars out there. They're eating it, but that's really part of the goal for me, because I want to see the butterflies as they finish that life cycle. There are some insects that perhaps would be problematic, some invasive insects or insects that are doing damage practices to some of your edible crops, but we want to identify them and make sure they're pests before we just start what they call spraying and praying. We're killing every insect in your landscape, which can throw the whole landscape out of balance. So once you've identified it, you can identify if it's a friend or a foe, and then if it is a foe, you can figure out ways to control it, whether that is physically removing that insect with your hand or with a spray of water, or maybe there's control that is an organic method that is more friendly to the environment, has less of a half-life if that kind of runs off your landscape into a nearby creek. Also, maybe you're choosing methods that are synthetic, and perhaps they're a little bit harsher. They could be a necessity to use non-organic insecticides depending on your management practice, but we want to make sure that if we are using those, we're applying per label instructions and we're not having any environmental consequences, whether that's neonicotinoids. We know that those are taken up through the plants, they're systemic, and they can have negative effect on bee populations. Or even if we're spraying organic or synthetic insecticide, to make sure we're not doing that when our insects or pollinators are active. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can read more about IPM, but the goal of IPM is not to eliminate pests, but just to eliminate the problem of the pest. So if we can reduce that, we can strengthen and stabilize the landscape and create conditions that are more favorable for the plants than the pests. If you are interested in gardening for pollinators and wildlife, we've got a great thing for you. With our partners at Water is Awesome, we have developed a pollinator pack for North Texas. And basically, this is a box of plants, some of our favorite native and adapted plants for our area, like Greg's Mistflower, black and blue salvia, Turk's cap, lance leaf coreopsis, wild bergamot, purple coneflower, Sundance rudbeckia, green milkweed, which is a great host plant for the monarchs, rattlesnake master. So many pollinators love that plant. Purple prairie verbena, Cinnaloan blue sage. Now, most of these plants are native to our area. All of them are going to be native to North or South America, adapted to our climate, adapted to our soils. So many beautiful bloomers on here. You get, for $75, you get 24 starter plants that come in 3-inch pots. They're compact, easy for kids and older folks, everybody in the family to plant. They also come with 3 designs to choose from. So Patrick has designed some amazing looking professional designs. We've got a rectangle option, a triangle option, and a circle option that cover about 125 square foot in your landscape. They thrive in spots from full sun to part shade. And the pictures we have seen from people planting these in year past, it's amazing to see the plants go in at kind of 3-inch containers. And then in 3 months or 6 months, the plants are just, taking off, beautiful blooms that are attracting all different types of pollinators. You can find more information about those kits at rootedin.com. Now, one of the things we've done in the kits, one of the things that Patrick has talked about, we'll talk about in more detail as we dig into the plants, but the benefits of layering, planting plants that have different heights, different sunlight requirements in the same spot, contrasting the form, the texture, the leaf size, and the shape, the different color of the leaves and the blooms, plants with different bloom times, so we can see kind of that ebb and flow, that roller coaster coaster of color in the landscape. And so as we dig deeper into specifically the plants in this next section, I want you to kind of think about that and think about the different combinations that you could do in your own landscape with your existing plants. And then Patrick's going to hit home with some of our favorite combinations.
All right, here we are on the final stretch of today's program, and we've been very excited to have you all join us today and kind of end this on a fun, colorful note, if you will, and talk a little bit about colors and all the different spectrums and the fun things that we have within plants. Again, like I talked about earlier, is we have a lot of the warm and the cool colors. Your warmer colors are going to be in your yellows to even your pinks. So reds and oranges being your warmest color. And again, those are the ones that stand out in the forefront. Your cooler colors are things like your blues and your greens and even getting into your violets. And then we start transitioning back into those warmer colors. But this can be a lot of fun and give you, again, a lot of definition. And some people are drawn to only certain colors in their garden, and that's fine too. And to each their own. We have clients, and I specifically ask them, are there colors you absolutely have to have and colors you absolutely don't want to have? And that's important for you to write this down and acknowledge that too, because you're going to be looking at this every day. We're not going to be looking at this every day. And there's nothing wrong with you not wanting certain plants. I talked earlier about some of my friends that are psychologists, and they talk about how certain colors evoke different responses within patients. And there are some colors like we think of, like yellows that are cheerful and things like that. Well, to some people, it can be irritating. It can be something that they're not drawn to. And so that's always something to think about. Whereas blues can be cooler, white can also help kind of drown out some things. So if you do a little bit more of a monochromatic garden, then you can tie in some white so that it kind of balances that out and you're not left with just all one color. This right here is just a fun chart that shows you all the different colors and how they have different responses in people. And you may be familiar or acknowledge some of this, where you can say, oh yeah, this color made me feel like that, or I really love this color because it makes me feel this. And that's also what the colors that we choose for indoors as well, and why so many people have their favorites. If you will. So gray and silver foliage was the color for 2021. Every year, the ASLA and many other organizations release a color of the year. And this year was whites and grays and silvers and even some silvery green colors that are a neutral tone. But they also, remember what I talked about with contrasting colors and contrasting textures, they also lend to giving you a lot of definition and contrast. I showed you just a minute ago those whale's tongue agaves in my front planters that I recently added. And this is what it looks like at maturity in this top of the screen. And putting that chartreuse green sedum below it is that color and texture contrast that I like, that gives me that definition. And some of the more popular silvery colored plants that are out there are things like lamb's ear, like you see right here, the gray bush germander that gives you that silvery leaf, even Texas sage. I also still love Dusty Miller. There's a Dusty Miller that I keep in my garden called New Look. It has the larger leaf look to it. But these give you that beautiful contrast in the gardens, and sometimes just fun to touch and feel. I'm a touch and feel person. I go through nurseries and gardens and constantly touching and feeling gardens. And then also those variegated plants, the white colors and even silver colors in the garden sometimes look like they're glowing. They really give you some of that definition. So this top picture is that variegated cast iron plant, the variegata is what it's called, that I showed you in my front water feature. And it really does, I can look out that front window and sometimes at night, all I see is the white. So it gives me a really cool texture at night. Lamb's ear also sometimes in the right like dusk lighting at night sometimes looks like it's glowing. And then even the variegated leaves, this is that spider web Aurelia I just showed you in my front garden. And then like things like the garden phlox, that their blooms don't close up at night. You can see those white blooms. And then one of the more popular people are very familiar with is like the moonflower, which is the datura in our garden. And it has that beautiful white bloom that opens up at dusk in the evening. I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is that's a bat's love these flowers, and that's why it's called the moonflower. And they really do, from a distance, look like they're glowing, almost like they have lights in them. And that's how you really darken up. And you can have night gardens. You know, there's certain arboretums and botanical gardens that do night tours. So you see the different wildlife and pollinators at night, and how some of these whites and silvers really do glow and brighten up a garden. So I have a lot of fun with this. I love silver foliage, but I also love monochromatic gardens. I have a lot of monochromatic design inside my home as well, as you can kind of see the wall behind me that gives a lot of texture, where I put a lot of different contrasting textures, but the same color palette. Maybe it's all cool colors. Like you see here, we've got a lot of those lavenders and whites and blues. This is called monochromatic. I'm sticking with that same color spectrum. And then over here, I have an all white garden. And then down here, I have all yellows. But you can see every plant individually. So when you do a monochromatic garden, it's really easy to pull off. It's not something that takes a whole lot of thought. You choose all the same color. The key is choosing different shaped blooms, different shaped leaves, so that you always have that definition and that contrast, and also different heights. Like you see in this garden here, this middle picture, there's a lot of different heights, different shaped blooms, different shades of the same color. You can see every plant individually. You don't want it to turn into a big old blob. And as you can see over here on this right picture, this monochromatic is all evergreen. So we have creeping junipers, we have upright junipers, arborvitae, all different types of things that give us that monochromatic texture look. And it gives us a lot of interest in there. One day, if I have more property, I would love to do a big evergreen garden like this. I love those contrasting evergreen looks in the garden. So you also sometimes can include some different. So again, it's the color spectrum, if you will. So you see this one on the right. I have a lot of yellows. You have the rising sun redbud, the abelias. But right there in the forefront, I have one little kind of specimen of that pink parade yucca, which is a hesperalo. And it really, that red stands out in the forefront. And then if you do all those oranges and yellows and the different shades of all those oranges and yellows, that garden is going to really be a dominating feature in your garden. Because remember, the reds and the oranges, everything, they stand towards the forefront. They really make a presence in your garden. And it just shows you all the different mixing, whether you want to do complementary colors or you want to do the color spectrum in your garden. We've seen it done many different ways. This left one right here is my favorite because I love blues and oranges together. I love reds and yellows together. But I also, on the right side, I love putting purples and reds together. I kind of call them the jewel tones. So when you go from violet to red to orange, you have those jewel tones going through, and that's a real popular term to use for those. Have fun with this. Make sure that they're contrasting. They're all playing off of each other and working well together, and give you that definition. Be really cautious with this. You know, I get really excited about certain plants. Like I have a lot of yuccas, but I make sure that the yuccas that I'm putting next to the yuccas in my yucca garden are contrasting with each other. They don't look exactly the same. Some fun combinations that are out there for your native plants. Native plants can also refer to some of those newer improved varieties like the Ruby Falls Redbud, which is the red leaf weeping redbud. I love the blue or the blonde ambition grass, which is a blue grama grass up here. And then you have like the four-nerved daisy as well as color guard yucca. So what we've done here is we've played off of all the colors, but the contrast. So if I put that big leaf together of the redbud with that blue, the grama, the blonde ambition grass in front of it, those contrasts of the textures and the colors is what gives us that definition in the garden. And then of course, yuccas we're all a big fan of and rooted in because of the contrasting textures that they do give us. Yellows of the four-nerve daisy also can be very bright and make a big presence. Shade combinations, I showed you pretty much every single one of these in my garden. The oak leaf hydrangeas, including some of the dwarfs that are out there if you don't have the space for that big standard 8x8. The rising sun redbud, which looks like this in the spring and the fall with that new growth. This is that ground palmetto that I have in my garden. And then there's the Turk's cap. This one actually has red and pink mixed Turk's cap, which is a lot of fun as well. And just mixing these, but you see The great thing about this is 3 of these plants are versatile from sun to shade. The Turk's cap, the palmetto, the red bud, the oak leaf hydrangea prefers the shade. But if I was going to transition this garden, if I'm going from sun to shade, I could keep going with those palmettos and that Turk's cap, and then transition more into a sunny garden where those plants will do well in both of those. And that again shows you those transitions in that design principle that I talked about. You know, having fun with cacti and agave, they're very popular, but one of the things I want you to be careful with is cacti rock or cacti succulent and agave gardens does not mean covering all your soil with rock. That doesn't necessarily mean that. Putting pockets of these in your landscape bedding can provide a lot of texture and contrast. If you want to do pocket gardens with a rock and all cacti, succulents, and agave, just do small portions of that. You don't want to cover all of our heavy clay soil and all rock. It actually can create more compaction. Remember, we're not Phoenix and Las Vegas and Santa Fe. We don't have a sandy-based soil. We have more of a clay-based soil. So that heavy rock can cause more compaction overall. And then getting into your evergreens. Wichita blue junipers are good alternatives to our Arizona cypress if you like that bluish gray color. Little gem magnolias are smaller versions of our southern magnolia with less of a destructive invasive root system. And then cherry laurels, there's standard cherry laurels and even compact cherry laurels that stay smaller. You're going to see this with a lot of plants. We have a lot of dwarf, compact, petite. That's because people still want the great qualities of those standard plants, but they don't have the space for them. And that's why we have bred things to be dwarfs. But when you mix these, look at that blue, gray color with that shiny green color with that almost kind of burgundy color leaf of the magnolia. You could put all 3 of these together maybe as a privacy screen or a line in your garden, and they're all going to contrast with each other but give you a really bulky kind of evergreen in your garden. It can be a lot of fun in the garden. There we go. Screen wouldn't progress. Some hot heat lovers out there. We love our mealy blue sage. Henry Dulberg's my favorite, which is Farinacea. Coreopsises give us a like daisy kind of look. Blackfoot daisy is a nice creeping. And then Mexican feathergrass. This combination right here, I kind of see as a real popular kind of sunny native type look. People tend to look at these plants and think, oh, that's real native kind of look. In the garden. And this combination gives you a full spectrum of color from the violets, blues, to the whites, to the yellows, and even the greens. So those whites and those greens really give you that warm, the cooler tones, and then yellow gives you that warmer tone in your garden. And there's other options out there. The Blackfoot daisy, the Rudbeckia, like the Goldsturm, could take the place of Coreopsis. You may decide that you want to do something that's more creeping like skullcap. And then your mealy blue sage, you could do the white version like Augusta Dulberg. So there's ways of changing these colors out depending on the heights that you want in that garden. Some of the truly native garden plants, the ones that we do know are 100% indigenous to the state. Autumn sage, our Salvia greggii, the red with that purple coneflower, and then the Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susans. To me, that almost screams native. Like though that combination of all those plants is just almost that staple base native perennial garden look. In the landscape, and you can have a lot of fun with this. And like I showed you, there's other varieties out there, like I have the Cheyenne Sunset Coneflower. Perennial grasses we love. They're great for our pollinators as well. That's where a lot of them take refuge. Little blue stem being our native. There's some dwarf out there as well. Getting into, again, some different Coreopsises out there. This is one that many people are familiar with seeing and leaving along the roadsides. Flame acanthus, wonderful for hummingbirds. There's the red flame acanthus and even the Benny gold flame acanthus, and then dwarf waxleaf or dwarf wax myrtles are a beautiful bird refuge. There's don't let dwarf scare you. You can still get 6 to 7 feet tall. It's just dwarf of the standard version that's out there. And then some of your semi-evergreen to evergreens. Autumn sage can be semi-evergreen depending on how hard our winter is. Texas sage, same thing, but as I showed you, it's blooming strong in my garden. Yarrows, this is a beautiful really heavy contrasting in color, texturing plant. And then all of your hesperallos, your yuccas, there's the yellow yucca, there's red yucca, there's a dwarf brake lights, there's even a desert dust that's a burgundy color that's out there now. But you can have fun with this and still be within that native spectrum in your garden. Some of our heat lovers are some more combinations. Again, there's that coneflower, there's that Mexican feathergrass, and then there's that Texas sage. And then sundrops is a nice kind of spreading perennial, makes a nice border plant in the front of the garden. Behind that, you could do the Mexican feathergrass and the coneflower. And then behind that, you could even do the Texas sage. And you're almost monochromatic with that because you have the purple coneflower and the Texas sage together. That makes a great a hot summer combination. Shade gardening, again, to give you some more ideas. Columbine's my favorite shade gardening plant. It brightens any dark spots. The beautyberry is a great shade garden plant. Give it a little bit of elbow room. It likes to get a little larger. And then surprisingly for evergreen that people don't know is dwarf yaupons are very shade tolerant. And I showed you that micron leaf, the really dwarf one in my front landscape, and then inland sea oats. If you have an area of your garden that especially maybe holds a little water, has poor drainage, inland sea oats help suck that moisture up and can help remedy, if not correct, a lot of poor drainage areas. Lyre-leaf sage is a great reseeding ground cover. If the plant stays very low, but then it puts the spike blooms on it, it will reseed itself. So give it its elbow room as well in the garden so it can really spread out for you. Getting into some of the cooler colors in your garden, getting into those violets. Texas mountain laurel, I showed you 2 varieties in my garden. You've got that glossy green leaf and the silver leaf. Oh, Texas rock rose is probably one of my favorite native perennials in the garden. Mine actually stayed semi-evergreen even with this year's winter. Pink skullcap, I showed you that one as well in front of my Farinacea. And then Greg's mistflower, which is one of our #1 nectar plants, especially for the monarchs, that you can have a lot of fun with. But this combination right here, your taller tree, which is your mountain laurel, your median shrub, which is your rock rose, stair step down into the Greg's mistflower, and then even a border plant is the skullcap. Gives you a lot of contrasting texture and a lot of contrasting color in your garden as well. We hope that you enjoyed the program today. We hope that it helps you step outside that box and think of some fun combinations of plants. And as you see, native plants are not something to be scared of. It's not a weedy looking mess. It can have a beautiful garden like you see in the picture in the backdrop here. So native, don't let that scare you. And native does not necessarily mean cacti, rock, and succulents. That's actually not what our native landscape looks like in North Texas. Have fun with this. Share pictures. We'd love to see some new combinations to share with other people. And we're excited that you joined us today. Reach out to us at RootedInTX on all social media. Our website's rootedin.com if you have questions. Daniel and I are happy to answer any questions right now if we have any on the call.